All right, so this is actually the last lecture I'm recording for the semester. I did things a little bit out of order here. So this lecture is on Native American politics. I should, going to this lecture, say this is not a topic I'm overwhelmingly familiar with. There's probably some of you in the class who actually have much more experience, much more knowledge on this topic. But I thought it was important, and I thought it was a topic that we should at least have some broad facts about. And so that's why I decided to give the short lecture. If this was a normal class, I've said that a lot in these videos, if this was a normal class, I really enjoy having much more of a conversation about this topic. Actually, I find the ideas about some of the internal politics for tribal politics is really interesting, and some of the sort of constitutional designs, like who gets to vote in tribal elections, who gets citizenship. I think those things are really interesting. But anyway, so I'll move forward here with this lecture. I just want to say I'm going to do my best to get terms and things right. If I get a term wrong, please don't hold that against me. I'm still, this is a topic again, I'm still just learning about. So I might slip up and say something wrong or use the wrong terminology. But again, please don't hold that against me. I'm trying my best here. But yeah, again, so this lecture is really just going to cover some basics. And I pulled most of this lecture from the two assignments. So one will be for the test, and there's another report that came out. And for the most part, both of these, the readings came from tribes put them together themselves. So that's what I used for my basis. Okay, so thinking about sort of the constitutional and legal basis for relationships between the federal government and tribal governments, and that's what most of this lecture is about, is the relationship between different kinds of different levels of government. So it's really not about any of the sort of the internal politics of tribes. Again, I find that interesting, but that's not really the point of this. So I want people to understand a little bit about how does the federal government interact with tribes, and also how state governments kind of don't interact with tribes. They do at some levels, but a lot of what we'll talk about today is at the federal level. We do have the Ask the Expert interview about the McGirt case, which is the map behind me. Takes place in Oklahoma, and so we get into some more of the details about the state there. This lecture is mostly focused on some changes we've seen over time, and a little bit about sort of the interaction between tribes and federal governments. So the constitutional basis and legal basis, and one of the big take-home points we should take here is that tribes and tribal government should be treated as, when we're thinking about government, separate nations. So while they could be wholly contained within a state or wholly contained within the current within the U.S. boundaries, we need to think of them as their own nation states. And so Article 1, Section 8 says the Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states with the Indian tribes. So which the saying is the federal government is the one that interacts with tribes, but it's also separating them, right? It's saying that they are distinct, not something that's it's not necessarily the same as a state, although in some ways it's similar, but putting this distinction here that the Indian tribes come up in the Constitution. And then this is from a legal case. Indian nations have always been considered as distinct, independent political communities retaining their original natural rights as the undisputed possessors of the soil. The very term nation, so generally applied to them, means people distinct from another. So again, this is how we should think about governments, the federal government interacting with tribal governments as a separate nation. So that's sort of the constitutional legal basis. So we'll get a few facts here that I pulled from this report. One is on population. So this is from the 2010 census, and we would expect obviously larger numbers in the 2020 census. So 5.2 million people, less than 2% of the US population, identified as American Indian or Alaskan Native alone, or a combination of other races. And so that's pretty common if you seen the census, you can check different boxes. So you could check one box as American Indian or Alaskan Native, or you could also check other boxes. And then just about 1% identified as American Indian or Alaskan Native alone. So that's pretty small percentage of the total U.S. population, but this is a population that's growing. So it was almost a 40% increase from 2000. And so the U.S. population itself grew at a smaller rate, 9.7%, but the native population grew at a much higher rate. So what that means too is the native population is generally younger than the U.S. population. I don't think we talked too much over the course of the semester about population growth in the U.S., but it's pretty slow. It's not quite the same as Europe, which is behind replacement. The U.S. might be close though, right? So replacement would be like two births, right? So 2 parents, 2 kids, right? And that's how you get the replacement rate. The US might be right around there, and there's lots of reasons for that, but at this point, that's another class. So small percent of the population total, but the population is growing at a pretty high rate. I'll be interested to see sort of what the 2020 census will look like. The median income tends to be a little bit lower, and so $40,000. I forget. This probably maybe it's from the 2010 census, and the national median is higher. But I'll show in the next slide that these numbers are changing. We're seeing a lot of growth in income for Native households. Smaller percent of the population that owns their own home. About 574,000 families, and this sort of just comes from the census. And then the poverty rate for Native people is higher, 26.8%, than the national rate, which is 4.6%. But again, this is something that's changing. So the economics are changing, and this is part of this change from the change to self-determination, and we'll get to what that means in a little bit here. But essentially, Native tribes have been given much more autonomy in how they operate, rather than the federal government saying what's going to happen. The tribes have been given much more leeway. So the economics are changing, and the sort of outside look is this is all sort of just casino gambling or gaming, but that's not true. So that does play a part, but there's other parts of this. So technology, manufacturing, retail. So it's a more just diversified economy than we might think. I think just the casinos, just especially here in Oklahoma, right? We think about the governor and the tribes have been fighting over the percent that should flow back to the states, or the way the state might tax. I have to say that carefully. Sort of gaming moves to the forefront, but there's lots of other industries or businesses. And then the per capita income has been growing, and it's been growing faster than the rest of the U.S. And so, as I said, it's sort of a movement away from how the federal government treated tribes, from one where the federal government was imposing rules and regulations, and probably putting it lightly, to letting the tribes run themselves. And there's sort of these other notions that probably aren't true. The idea that the federal government is just sort of like pumping money into the tribes, and that's how they've changed the sort of level of income. But the federal government actually doesn't spend a lot of money, per capita money, on Indian affairs compared to the rest of the U.S. So it's not the federal government sort of subsidizing what's going on here. And this chart just talks about sort of the changes this is on reservation per capita income from 1990 to 2000. So you see a big increase through gaming, 36%, but still a big increase, 30% of income from non-gaming. This compares to 11% change in per capita income for the total US. So incomes are moving in the positive direction. Just real quick, it's worth looking at a map of reservation lands. So big picture is most of the lands are in the center to the west, and much less in the east. So I grew up on the East Coast, and there's much less there. This is sort of the standard map. Under the McGirt case, we might expect things to change. So I don't know how, what the map would look like. Those policies are still working themselves out. Sort of moving forward with that. But so a lot in South Dakota, and some of the sort of more western states, and then some here in Oklahoma. I would have expected more in Oklahoma, and that might be a definition thing about the way lands are defined. Again, like, I'm not an expert on this. This is sort of like a standard map that I found. So talk about some of the native government periods. And so what I mean here is the sort of interaction between the US federal government and tribes. The relationship has changed over time. It's ebbed and flowed to probably better for the tribes or worse for the tribes. And some of that has to do with the US federal government wanting land for non-native settlers as they moved west. So if we have this long period, so I'm going to sort of skip before the Civil War. So we're starting 1887, so it's this generation past the Civil War. And so here we have the Dawes Act. And what this did was, in part, and there's other parts to it too, it sort of took away this idea of lands held by a community, right? So we might think of land as held by private entities, although there's actually lots of government land. But this push, this allotment, was to separate out the small parcels of land for ownership to individuals. So taking away the community owning of the land and giving it to individuals. And of course, over time, this gets, things might get sliced up smaller and smaller, right? So a family, just think of a family of 2 parents and kids might get some land, but then the kids, maybe they'll divide the land, and then it gets divided smaller and smaller up. So it's a way that the land would get, individual plots might get smaller and smaller. So this took away this idea of communal land, and really what this happened, the reason for this was to take away more land. And so this opened up more land for settlers, and sometimes without any sort of compensation. We get a short period. So at the sort of 30s to the 40s, this reorganization period. So this ended the allotment idea, and gave some land back to tribal nations and tried to give a little bit of help to tribes. And so this is a pushback, although very short, from the allotment period into this reorganization period that was probably better for tribes than the prior period. Then we have the termination period, which is generally not good. So Congress terminates the recognition of lots of tribes, of over 100 tribes. It lets state governments sort of impose criminal and civil jurisdictions in some states, and that's not what we have today, for the most part. And so this was generally not a good period for a lot of tribal nations. So loss of land, resources, and relocation of tribal communities. And so this was seen as not a good period. And so what was the reaction to this? There was protest. So again, tribes were losing recognition. They were subject to state and local control. And so this moves us away from the idea that tribes should be treated as nations, right? It's more of treating as individuals rather than as a group. And then they were subject to state and local control. So probably moving away from the way the Constitution and some of these early court rulings thought about relationships between the federal government and tribes, and pushed it down to basically no relationship. Well, not no relationship, but something where the state and local government has more control. again, so this losing of backing from the federal government, individuality of the autonomy of the different tribes, losing federal services, losing land, right? So generally just not a good period. And so you see an Indian rights movement and a couple sort of famous protests. So one is occupying the San Francisco Bay Prison, or Alcatraz, from 69 to 71. So this sort of was abandoned prison. And it was trying to use this idea. There's a law that if there's unused federal property, it reverts to the tribes. And so it was more probably trying to draw attention, and it did, to the issue. So that was one famous protest. Another is the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs headquarters leading up to 1972 election. And so this one is, for me at least, is less well known. The Alcatraz is more well known. And this sort of put the Nixon White House in a bad light, right? So these are sort of two of the highlights of the protest, but this pushes Nixon into making some changes. And so it leads us into the self-determination era. So in 1975, we start the return to internal self-government. So again, we're moving away from the termination era, where the federal government was not recognizing the tribal governments, to the self-determination era, which allowed a lot of the tribes to basically both run their own internal governments, but also the tribes would interact with the federal government almost as equals, right? So you would have to have negotiations. The state government can no longer impose regulations on tribes. Again, for the most part, there's going to be all sorts of things around the edges here. So I'm just trying to get at the big picture. The self-determination era, it didn't happen overnight, but Nixon was one who pushed it. So he gave a speech, and then later on there was some legislation that was passed, the education bill. But the way I think about tribal governments and tribes is think about them essentially as states. I know I probably contradicted myself a little bit at the beginning of the lecture, but so subject to federal law, but they have their own governments, constitutions, judicial systems, etc. So rather than, sort of the states imposing all these things, think of them, even if they're entirely contained within a state, they have these own things that we would see in the federal government, also see at state governments. So they need to do their own internal nation building. So this was a big shift, right? And so having to write your own constitution, having to just come up with judicial systems. And so this is a lot of turmoil, a lot of change. So it's hard, right? Writing constitutions is hard. I teach a class on writing constitutions, and it's hard to think about all the questions, although there's also a lot of the really good constitutions and research on this. But so there's a lot of powers within the self-government, control of cultural and religious affairs. I don't know if you read all of these, but control over natural resources. And in Oklahoma, this could mean oil, right? And there's some pretty famous examples of this in Oklahoma, deciding who's citizens, how are people taxed, civil and criminal law. These are all very important questions that tribes and governments have to grapple with. So we think about this. If you think back to our lecture on state, local government federalism, we need to modify it a little bit when we think about tribes. So for individual citizen, right, we think about how we talked about this at the beginning of the semester. We had an individual citizen with power and autonomy flowing through the state and then the federal government. But here we add, for tribal citizens, the tribe as well. So rather than the dual nature, it's a three-part. And then if we think about the governments, so in America we have, or the United States, federal government, tribal nations, and states. So all three having to interact with each other. With, there's different places where the different circles here have more power over the others. But again, it's important to think of the tribal nations as distinct, right? Not subsumed by the federal government or the states, but distinct. So tribal citizens vote in state, federal, and tribal elections, and the tribes can determine their own citizenship. And some are different, sort of the few bigger picture things I've looked at, right? Some might be based off of where you live. Some might be based off of maybe deciding membership, but you don't live on tribal land. And so, tribes can decide this on their own. So, and the things you pick, might get you different outcomes. Tribal citizens pay federal taxes and have to abide by federal laws and regulations. But generally, state laws are less applicable. And that was the sort of the point, or the conclusion sort of from the McGirt case, was this should be either a tribal or a federal issue, not necessarily a state issue. And so we sort of removed the self-determination era, removed this one-size-fits-all policy that the federal government was just imposing on different entities, where it might work for one, but not necessarily one for others. So again, I've said this a bunch of times, try to come up with their own policies, their rules, their laws that get a fit, that get to work for them. I thought I'd just talk very briefly about federal recognition. So we talk about like the federally recognized tribes. One thing I thought was pretty interesting is that you can get recognition from each of the levels of government. So one way is via an act of Congress. And so Congress, although the president would have to sign the legislation, but so that's one path to federal recognition. Another is from the judiciary, so a decision by the US court, or you could do it administratively through the executive branch. So either the three branches of government have the ability to provide recognition. And so the administrative one is probably the hardest, and you can read through what some of the criteria are, but that's the hardest path. The act of Congress might be the easiest. I don't know. This is sort of just thinking about like what's easy and what's hard. Like if Congress wants to pass a bill, it can do it pretty easily, but they have to want to do it. So it could be a much longer process than I'm thinking about, but Congress has the ability to act quickly. The federal bureaucracy tends to not act quickly. And then going through the court, different path altogether. So just a little bit real quick about sort of the politics of this. It's kind of interesting. So if you think about self-determination, it's basically local home rule, which is a conservative political ideal, right? So conservatives want to have a smaller federal government, let power be back home, either in the states or localities. So it's a very like small c conservative way of thinking about politics. And it's Nixon, who's a Republican, pushed self-determination at the federal level. Now, he wasn't the only one. It wasn't like he came up with this idea on his own, but Nixon, a Republican, started this, or moved it forward by quite a lot, and started earlier, right? Of course, there's outside forces acting here too, but so sort of say like, if you didn't know, and I said, all right, who pushed self-determination era and listed some presidents, unless you knew, you probably wouldn't pick Nixon. Nixon actually, in some ways, is not, there's other issues where Nixon isn't very conservative either, or traditional or modern conservatism, I don't know what you want to call it. Also started the EPA. And so, I don't know, Nixon's an interesting president, good and bad, I guess. But on the flip side, so this idea of supporting the rights of ethnic minorities is really like a liberal ideal in the modern sense, or we could think today probably more democratic, the Democratic Party, and we could point to examples where each party is probably on different sides of this, but it's both conflicting, but sort of you can find positives within sort of the both liberal and conservative ways of thinking about politics here. Federal government just reading through some of the reports, it talked about how the government is duty bound to be a protector of financial and natural resources for tribes. And so the logic behind the self-determination is, okay, the federal government still has to be this protector here, but the best way it can be the protector is let the tribes do it themselves. And so the duty is still there, but rather than the federal government imposing the rules and regulations, it lets the tribes govern themselves, because they see that's the best way to protect these interests. And then finally, again, this is a pretty short lecture, thinking about who supports Native politics the most, or rather, how did Natives vote? Native overwhelmingly vote Democratic. It's not entirely true, but tend to vote Democratic. I think tribal votes in Nevada came up in this last election. But at the same time, there's some, Tom Cole, Mark McMullen, are both Native. If you go back through Oklahoma history, there's been other representatives who have been Native from both political parties. And now there'll be more. There's more than Mark McMullen and Tom Cole in the current Congress. I just brought them up because they're from Oklahoma. So this is an issue that's going to continue to evolve. Hopefully, stay on. I think the path that it's on, where stay in this self-determination era rather than turning backwards into some of the other policy paths. So again, this is just like a very broad overview, but I think it's important to know how some of the changes in interaction between governments, the state government and federal government and tribes, as well as the idea that tribes think of them as nations, and not, it's not a local government and the state government can impose things. Think about them as a separate nation. So I hope between this and then our Ask the Expert interview, which we'll actually talk to a real expert who knows some things rather than me here, I hope you at least learned a little bit. And again, there's going to be some of you who knew all this already, and maybe if you come and take a different course from me, we can talk more about it. All right, so there's the end.